All right, so we are in the period of retirement. And how many periods within this period, how many retirements, I should say, were there in this period of retirement? Four. All right. Now we've already dealt with three, and we're in the fourth one now. And there's more scripture devoted to the fourth period of retirement where Jesus is retiring from the crowds to teach his apostles special lessons. There's more devoted to that in the Bible than the first three. So we're going to be in this fourth retirement for the rest of this month. And then after that, we go into the next period that follows the period of retirement, which is what period? The close of his ministry. Yeah. So this overall period of retirement lasts 6 months. It started about 1 year before Jesus died. And we're well into that time. So Jesus has less than a year now. I don't know exactly how much less, but he has less than a year before he's going to die. And then once the close of Jesus' ministry starts, that is the last 6 months before we come down to the final week. So what we're going to be studying today comes after, Jesus' conversation with his apostles in Caesarea Philippi and that great confession that I just talked about in the Lord's Supper talk, and Brian talked about on Wednesday night. We're going to be talking about the Transfiguration. Now, if you were a good student and you did your homework in preparation for today's class, you studied more material than what I'm going to cover. And I just wanted to hone in on this because it's just so encouraging and so uplifting and so faith building. And so I think it's going to really encourage all of us. So the main point that we're going to get out of this is that the apostles were eyewitnesses of his majesty. The apostles were eyewitnesses of his majesty. Right? So the three synoptics all cover this particular event. And they all give about the same amount of attention to it. So it's kind of hard to pick which one do I go with. So I just went with the default. I went with Matthew. But we're going to bring in a little bit of Mark, and we're going to bring a whole lot of Luke, because Luke's account is much more detailed in many ways. So we'll be bringing in a lot of that, but we'll be just basically following Matthew. So let's turn there, if you're not already there, to Matthew 17. And we're going to read verses 1 through 8. Matthew 17, beginning in verse 1, says 6 days later, that is after the things that he taught there at the end of Matthew 16. 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John, his brother, and led them up on a high mountain by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his face shone like the sun, and his garments became as white as light. And behold, Moses and Elijah appeared to them, talking with him. Peter said to Jesus, "Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, I will make 3 tabernacles here, one for you, and one for Moses, and one for Elijah." While he was still speaking, a bright cloud overshadowed them, and behold, a voice out of the cloud said, "This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him." When the disciples heard this, they fell face down to the ground and were terrified. And Jesus came to them and touched them and said, "Get up and do not be afraid." And lifting up their eyes, they saw no one except Jesus himself alone. There is so much here. This is such a powerful story. And this event impacted the apostles, especially Peter. It really made an impact, and it should make an impact on us as well. So let's kind of go through verse by verse and take some points here. So first, verse 1 tells us that Jesus took these 3 that he often takes with him where he doesn't take the rest of the 12, and that was Peter and James and John, the brothers. And so he has them with him on this mountain. What mountain? Ma'am? we're not really told, we don't know for sure, but as Joe was just saying to me, y'all couldn't hear him, but he was saying Hermon, that's the most likely candidate because the last place we read of Jesus being was what city? Caesarea Philippi. That's right. And Mount Hermon is located a little northeast, several miles of Caesarea Philippi. It's the closest mountain. It's the best guess that we would have. We can't say for sure this was the mountain, but this is our best guess. Here's a picture of Mount Hermon. So it's snow-capped. So that shows how high this mountain is, how tall it is. And here's a picture from kind of the top. And this is in the winter, clearly, when this picture was taken. In fact, today it's a ski resort. That's how big this mountain is. It's big enough to ski on, and it's a ski resort. I kind of doubt that those ski lifts were there at the time of Jesus. I don't know if people were into skiing yet. But this is the most likely candidate for the mountain. Now, Luke adds a lot of details, as I said. One detail that he adds that Matthew and Mark don't talk about is that Jesus took Peter, James, and John and went up on the mountain to pray. Like that was the reason they went up on the mountain. He went up there to pray. And this transfiguration happened while he was praying. Isn't that fitting? Is there a time in our lives that we feel closer to God than when we're praying? For me, there's not. There is no more intimate moment of my relationship with my Heavenly Father than when I'm actually talking to Him and pouring my heart out to Him. One preacher defined prayer as the means by which we attain oneness with God. And so it's fitting that in that time of oneness with Jesus communicating with His Father, that this marvelous event, that this divine occasion, this miracle happens. And by the way, just as a side note, don't we often see Jesus doing this kind of thing? He often goes to mountains to pray. Just over and over, He goes to mountains. Not just anywhere, He goes to mountains. Why do you think He went to mountains to pray? Get away from the crowds? And maybe also, it's a place that helps you just feel like, you know what, I'm in nature, and it's just easier to think about God when you're in nature. I just want to encourage all of us, just on a practical level, find your mountain. It doesn't have to literally be an elevated thing, but find some outdoor area that you like to go and pray and frequent it. It might be your backyard. It might be walking on the sidewalk and praying in your mind in your neighborhood, which is kind of what I tend to do. But find some outdoor place that you can frequent and pray. You'll find that just to be such a refreshing thing and help. Just practically, I have found that's very, very helpful. So it's while he was praying that all this stuff starts happening. The word transfigured that we have there in verse 2, he was transfigured before them, is translated from a Greek word that is pronounced It's pronounced metamorphao in the Greek. Metamorphao. Now, obviously, what English word do we get from that? Metamorphosis. And that would be what we call a transliteration. So a translation of metamorphao would be transfigured. That's a translation. Transliteration is let's just take those Greek letters and let's make a new English word out of it. Metamorphosis, right? So we have, baptism is a transliteration of the Greek word baptisma, right? So that's the case. But here it's a translation. But we understand what a metamorphosis is. So that helps us understand what this transfiguration was. It's a word that can be used to talk of something or someone turning into something totally different, like a man turning into an animal, right? It's that kind of word in writing that could be used to describe that. It's the same word that was used in Romans 12:2 in the famous passage where Paul said, "And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed." Be transfigured. Same word. By the renewing of your mind and so forth. So this transfiguration is basically a transformation. It's just another way of saying it. And it's not that he turned into something different, but it was that he was revealing his spiritual body. I believe that's what's happening here. He was revealing his spiritual body in appearing in glory. Luke doesn't use the word transfigured. Luke just says the appearance of his face became different. Okay? And so let's talk about the appearance of his face for a moment. Let me ask you a question. What other Bible characters, maybe you can only think of one, there's one and maybe two that I can think of, that's faces shone? Okay, that's the one everybody knows of. Is there another one that's a possible that you can think of? I'm not sure. I don't think. And this is kind of just, I mean, there's probably no way you would have just thought of this. But in Acts 6:15, when Stephen was standing before the council, it says his face was like the face of an angel. Now, that can be interpreted different ways. It doesn't necessarily mean his face was shining, but how are angels often described? They're usually bright and shining. So that could be what it means. Some think the face of an angel just means he had like confidence and he just was undeterred. He wasn't afraid of this council. So it could be that too. But definitely Moses. In Exodus 34:29, it talks about when Moses was coming down from Mount Sinai with the 2 tablets, that he did not know that the skin of his face shone because of God speaking, or his speaking with God. And just literally, you look at his face and he didn't know it. What did he do about that? What did he do when that glory started to fade? Yes. Now, he didn't put a veil over his face to hide the glory. That was good for people to see. But he didn't want people to see the fading of the glory. So he would put a veil over his face to cover that. But that's for another study. So those are a couple of other individuals. So when we read of Jesus' face shining, if you're a student of the Bible, and certainly if you're Peter, James, and John, it might bring to mind Moses. Moses' face shone. Why? Because he was speaking with God. That's not why Jesus' face shone. Why was Jesus' face shining? Because he is God in the flesh. Right? So that's kind of encouraging. In Revelation chapter 1, in that description of the glorified Christ, in symbolic terms, in a vision, this wasn't the actual Jesus. It tells us in Revelation 1:16 that his face was like the sun shining in its strength. And maybe that kind of harkens back to the transfiguration. But that was a vision in Revelation 1. The transfiguration wasn't a vision. We need to understand this wasn't just a vision. This was actually happening right before them. It was literally happening. Jesus was being changed and transformed, transfigured. I love this verse. Hebrews 1 and verse 3. And he is the radiance of his, or God's, glory. Don't you love that? Amen. I think we need to take that phrase with us and maybe later this week offer a prayer up to God, thanking him that his Son is the radiance of his glory. I just love that. It just gives me chills, those words. So powerful. He is the radiance of his glory and the exact representation of his nature. You see how those concepts are tied together? The radiance tied with the exact representation of his nature. And so I think that that's part of what we get from his transfiguration. Well, I hope I haven't already answered this next question for you. I probably put it in the wrong place. But what is the significance of the fact that Jesus appeared in this glorious form? Can you think of anything else that I haven't mentioned?
Well, further convince them that he is who he says he is.
Amen. To convince them he is who he says he is. We're going to talk more about the significance of that as it relates to Moses and Elijah. You had any other thoughts, Phil?
What you have here is two things. You've got God revealing himself in his purest form, and you have man in his humanity trying to understand something he doesn't understand. It's the tangible trying to understand the intangible.
Yes.
We don't have the tools and are not equipped to understand what he was showing them.
Yeah.
But they were so caught up in the earthly and the physical kingdom and all the other physical types that they couldn't stretch their mind to go beyond that.
Yeah.
He took them there to a place they'd never been.
Yeah.
Way beyond. And so now they had to reshape everything.
Yeah.
Everything that they believed now had a different twist to it. Because they could no longer see it in the same form they had it in before.
Absolutely. I like how you said that. This was, I forget exactly how you said it, but basically the idea of people in this physical realm trying to understand something that was shown to them that was spiritual in nature. And it was hard for them to wrap their heads around. The apostles were on this continuing journey of really learning who Jesus was, how powerful he really was. And this event is going to take their understanding to an all-new level. Right? Good. Okay, I want to look at so come back to our main point. The apostles were eyewitnesses of his majesty. And particularly, in this case, Peter, James, and John were eyewitnesses of this exact majesty that we're talking about. John 1:14. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we saw his glory. Who wrote that? John. John was there and saw his glory. Am I saying that's exactly what he's talking about in verse 14? I don't think he's limiting it to that. It seems to me that he's saying in general, we who are alive when Jesus was alive, we saw his glory, but John saw his glory in a powerfully unique way. And I just can't help but think maybe he had that in mind as he wrote that in John 1 and verse 14. I can't prove that, but he did see his glory in a unique way. And Peter wrote about this as well. We're going to talk about this passage later, but I just wanted to show you a glimpse of part of it. In 2 Peter 1 and verse 16, he says at the end of that verse, but we were eyewitnesses of his majesty. It's powerful. And here's another verse, y'all. This one is, take this verse and put it in the slow cooker. What do you call those things? The pressure cooker or something like that. Put it in that. Not the real one. Let it tenderize. I want you to take this verse and maybe meditate on it later this week. Beloved, now we are children of God, and it has not appeared as yet what we will be. We know that when he appears, we will be like him, because we will see him just as he is. What are we going to be like in heaven? I don't know. But we're going to be like him. We're going to be in a spiritual glorified body because we're going to see him as he is. Not as Jesus the Nazarene in the physical form, but we're going to see him in that spirit form. And I believe that this story of the Transfiguration gives us perhaps more insight into what heaven might kind of be like and what Jesus might kind of look like than any other passage. They recognized him, but he was in a glorious spiritual body. And Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians 15 and talks about in Philippians 3:20 and 21 that when Jesus returns and we are resurrected, what's going to happen to our body? It's going to be transformed. It's going to be transfigured into conformity with what? His glorious body. And we will be like him and see him as he is. That's powerful. That to me is just really, really powerful. So Moses and Elijah, there in verse 3, and behold, Moses and Elijah appeared to them talking with him. This is incredible. These guys have been dead for years. And they appear. And apparently, they were recognizable. Apparently, they looked like people. But they were also in a glorious form. We'll talk about that in a second. But why did these two individuals, Moses and Elijah, why did they appear with Jesus?
Well, you said earlier that Moses brought the law, and that God gave to him, and Elijah is one of the major prophets.
Okay, good. Phil?
Romans 3:21. That they were witnesses, the law and the prophets were witnesses to the righteousness of God.
Great verse. The law and the prophets. Often, when the Old Testament was summed up in a few words, it would be referred to as the law and the prophets. And rarely, sometimes it was the law, the prophets, and the writings. But usually just law and the prophets. So Moses represents the law. Elijah represents the prophets. Collectively, they represent the Old Testament. Now, I don't know what this might have meant to the apostles at first. Maybe they thought, oh, wow, the Old Testament's here to stay. Moses and Elijah are back. The law of Moses, wouldn't they have loved for the law to just continue on perpetually? It's going to, in the future, it's going to be a struggle for them to grapple with this idea of a new covenant and doing away with the law of Moses and all of that. And, you know, Acts chapter 10 and all those things with Peter and the vision he saw with the animals lowered down and all of that. I mean, it was going to be a process for them to grasp. They see Moses and Elijah. Oh, this represents the law, obviously, of Moses and represents the prophets. But they're appearing with Jesus. Jesus was the fulfillment of the law. Jesus was the fulfillment of the prophets. And he came to bring something new. So at least I think that's part of the significance of what's going on here. Do y'all have any other thoughts on that? Any further significance of Moses and Elijah appearing? Brian, you got anything to help me out with?
There are other things that you can look at. There's probably meaning to it that we don't grasp, like 40 days of fasting. They've all three done that. You know, you also have a part in a very unique way, this planet. There's other stuff there. I'm not sure how it all ties in, though. That little things like that about these three.
There's some, you know, like Elijah, he ascended to heaven, didn't he? Jesus ascended to heaven. Of course, Jesus died first. Elijah never died. When Moses died, do you remember how he was buried? On Mount Nebo? God buried him. And Jude talks about that his body was guarded. I believe he says by an angel. So there's just some very unique circumstances about the deaths of these men. And it shows how special they were. How, you know, just absolutely pleasing in God's sight that they were. And in that way there's some connection with Jesus. But I'm not sure what all correlations to make, but yeah. Joe?
When Susan and I were reading through this last night, and one thing she had brought up is, how did they know that was Moses and Elijah? They really didn't have pictures. They were dead for years and years and years.
They didn't have a Facebook page?
That was coming up next week. So.
Yeah.
But it's interesting that they knew who they were with never knowing what they were.
Yeah.
And it's not recorded that they said anything, if I understand.
Right. Yeah.
So I just think that's very unique, that somehow they knew this is Moses and this is Elijah, because he said, hey, let's go here.
Yeah, they did.
Very powerful.
I read in one commentator that this perhaps gives us a little insight into heaven, that we will recognize one another and instantly. I don't know. I mean, you think, you know, our understanding is going to be different in heaven than it is on earth. I don't know if it's going to be that we have to like learn things progressively as we do now, or if we just instantly know things. I'm not sure how it's going to be. I don't want to go down a path that I can't tell you an answer to, but yeah, it is fascinating. They recognize these men. They'd never seen Moses and Elijah, but for whatever reason, and maybe it was because they were talking and they could hear Jesus referring to Moses and referring to Elijah. Maybe they didn't recognize them. That might be a bit of an assumption. So, yeah, we might be, you know, we might just need to be careful about it. But Dave?
Might be because of what they were talking about. In Luke's account, it says they were talking about Jesus' departure.
Yes.
About his upcoming death.
Yes.
And both the law and the prophets spoke of this happening.
Yes. Very good. Okay, I'm going to get to that also. So I wanted to just mention as a side note, in Luke 9:31, it says that Moses and Elijah appeared in glory. That detail is not mentioned by Matthew or Mark. So Jesus is in this glorious form, but also in some glorious form, Moses and Elijah are appearing there as well. And that would make sense if they are in their transformed bodies. All right, and Luke, also in that same verse, it says that they were, as Dave just mentioned, speaking of his departure, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. Don't you wish we knew what they said exactly? I mean, isn't that fascinating? Jesus is having a conversation with Moses and Elijah, who've been dead hundreds of years, and he's talking to them about the fact that he's going to die. So we know that Moses and Elijah understand. And you just think about, it just makes me think about characters like Abraham, you know, the 3 promises that were given to him. And he wouldn't have understood that spiritual promise, but he understands it now. I think that there's an understanding in the spirit realm of the plan of Jesus. In Luke 9:32, it says, "Now Peter and his companions had been overcome with sleep." So this is a new detail. So when they go up there to pray, Jesus is praying, the disciples are sleeping. What does this kind of remind you of? What other occasion did this happen? All right, when Jesus was in the garden, right, of Gethsemane, and same 3 guys falling asleep, but to Jesus, prayer was more important than sleep. Let that be a little side point. Sometimes prayer needs to be more important than sleep. It's that important. It's that important. And so they're asleep, and Luke tells us is when they woke up and they just see Moses and Elijah there talking with Jesus. It's like they wake up to this scene. Can you imagine just waking up to that? And that's when Peter says in verse 4, "Lord, it is good for us to be here." That might also be rendered, "It is good for us to stay here. If you wish, I will make 3 tabernacles here, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." When he said tabernacles, the word there is referring to a temporary structure, a temporary like booth, like they would make in the feast, like the Jews would make in the Feast of Booths, commemorating their years of wandering in the wilderness when they lived in temporary shelters. So that's what he's offering to make. Just hold on a minute. Let me put this thing together. It's just sticks and branches, and it'll be a temporary shelter. That's the best he could think to say at that moment. Question: why did Peter offer to make 3 tabernacles? What was he thinking? What's your best thought on that?
They're going to be here for a while. They're going to be here for a while.
Okay, they're going to be here for a while. Okay, Dave?
It's Peter's way of honoring all 3 of them.
Okay.
And his mistake was making all 3 of them equal. And
Okay.
God's going to correct that. But it is his way of honoring, I think.
Okay, his way of honoring them. Okay, those are good thoughts, Joe.
Yeah, just kind of on top of that, he didn't see Jesus as replacing them. He saw them on 3. So that's why he said 3 as opposed to Jesus.
So maybe that he saw them as like equal.
Yeah, like-
Never thought of that. That's a possibility. Tim?
Well, you know, this comes on after the confession that Peter has made of who Jesus is. And we're coming into this, and they understand some things about Jesus. They definitely do, but they don't have a clear picture, which is going to come up. I don't want to give it away, because what's said answers some of this.
Yes. Thank you for not stealing my thunder.
But that's what it is. It's leading into a profound statement.
Yeah, very good, very good. Yeah, that's rule number 1 in my classes is don't steal my thunder. Right? You can steal Brian's thunder, but don't steal mine. Steal his all day long. I don't care about that. All right. Here's the best I can give you, a couple of verses that give us some indication of why Peter said this as far as the Scripture tells us. Mark 9:6 says, "For he did not know what to answer." So he didn't know what else to say. This is the best thing he could come up with, the best thought he could have, maybe to as Dave said, maybe to try to honor them. But I think here's basically what was going on. Luke 9:33 says, "And as these were leaving him," were leaving Jesus. As Moses and Elijah were leaving Jesus, Peter said to him, "Master, it's good for us to stay here. Let us make 3 tabernacles." You see the point there in that context? The point is, he didn't want them to leave. He wanted them to stay. Who wouldn't want them to stay? So he sees them leaving. I don't know if they're walking away or start fading away or what that would have looked like, but no. let me make 3 tabernacles. Y'all stick around. Maybe he wanted it to be this way forever. Maybe he thought this was the beginning of some new era. And he's totally missing the point. It says at the end of verse 33, not realizing what he was saying. There are times it's best just to keep your mouth shut. This would have been one of those good moments for Peter just to be in awe and be quiet. But he had to open his big mouth. But he was trying. He was just trying. And then we learned that this cloud, this bright cloud, verse 5, while he was still speaking, a bright cloud overshadowed them. And again, I don't know if it was Mount Hermon, but there are a lot of clouds up in Mount Hermon. And it's not hard at all to imagine a cloud over, overshadowing you. And this is a picture of clouds up in Mount Hermon. But apparently this happened quickly, because it happened like while he was speaking, there was this cloud that overshadowed them. And it's described as a bright cloud. Now, where else in the Bible do we read about a cloud in a mountain? Sinai. And that cloud was dark, and there was thunder, and there was lightning, and the people were afraid. You see the difference of this cloud? It's bright. This is not the law of Moses anymore. This is not Mount Sinai. It makes me think of the passage in Hebrews 12 that we have not come to Mount Sinai, but we have come to Mount Zion, this new church, this new covenant of Christ. And so the bright cloud overshadowed them. And then God speaks, "This is my beloved Son with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him." Now, where else has God said something like that from heaven? The baptism of Jesus, right? Baptism of Jesus. And so this is a second time, which shows how significant this moment is. But he says there at the end, listen to him. Listen to him. You got Moses, you got Elijah who appeared, but the one you really need to listen to is Jesus. Why is this statement by God so powerful and meaningful given the context in which God said it? Listen to him. What would that have really meant to the apostles? Jay?
Other than Jesus himself, this is the first time that the apostles are hearing God say that it's his Son. It's not just self-proclaimed.
Okay. That's a good point. I don't know. You're right. We don't have any indication that the other apostles were there at Jesus' baptism. He hadn't chosen them yet. Of course, many of them were followers of John the Baptist, so they could have heard that. But potentially, this is the very first time they are hearing that from heaven. That's one good thought. Randy?
I don't know if this is where you're going, but here you've got two of the greatest, if not the two greatest men of the Old Testament.
Yes.
And now Jesus is presented as clearly superior to them.
Yes. Yeah, and these two men, Moses and Elijah, represent the law and the prophets. They represent the Old Testament. God is paving the way for them to understand, listen, there's something new. I don't want you so focused on the Old Testament. You're focused on Jesus. This was paving the way for the new covenant. I'm going to show you a verse in a minute, but I saw a couple other hands. Brian.
Yeah, and if we realize there's that parallel with Jesus and Moses with Mount Sinai and the cloud and all of that, it's like Jesus is the new Moses. He communicates with me, and then he tells you what I say. Ultimately.
Yes, just like God would speak through Moses, God is now speaking through Jesus. Tim?
Simple one, Jesus' words, we are to listen to them, because the authority is there.
Oh, yes.
Simple concept.
We have to listen and have ears to hear, and there's been a lot that Jesus has said about that. Those are really great thoughts. Love this verse, Hebrews 1 and 2, this passage. God, after he spoke long ago to the fathers, in the prophets, in many portions and in many ways, in these last days, and we are in the last days, this messianic age, has spoken to us in his Son, whom he appointed heir of all things, through whom also he made the world. That's just the exact point you guys were just making. So, great thoughts. So the apostles were eyewitnesses of his majesty. All right. Now, we're going to go to 2 Peter chapter 1. So turn your Bibles to 2 Peter, the first chapter. Before we go here, does anybody have any other thoughts on the Transfiguration? Any other maybe questions or comments? Yes, sir?
You mentioned Deuteronomy 18:15, where the Lord God will raise up a prophet like us, me.
Yes.
Listen to him.
Yes. Yeah, Deuteronomy 18. And that was Jesus. And, you know, it's interesting, when Moses made that prophecy, that there would be a prophet come up like him, he didn't really know who that was. He just, through the Spirit, made the prophecy, but, of course, at this time, he understands it. He understands it. All right, good. Any other thoughts or questions there? Mr. Tom? No, please.
I probably was gone for the comment that and just before this in Luke 8, the disciples have watched a man possessed with legion come forward and say, without preamble, don't torment me, to this carpenter that got out of the boat. And I've just putting myself in place of the disciples to watch this companion of theirs be feared, as if this person is seeing something they can't see, like they are now seeing the reality of the transformation. These beings are seeing continually this
Spirit,
powerful being.
Spirit being. Yeah, this is another interesting thought about what the demons saw, and when they saw Jesus. That's a good thought. Jack?
Just real quick, Adam, there's a bookend to that passage you read at the beginning of Hebrews. It's in chapter 12, verse 23. It says, "See that you refuse not him who speaks." That's got to be Jesus.
Absolutely.
And there's a warning there. Do not refuse him who speaks.
Yeah, absolutely. Very, very good. Very powerful. I love this passage, and I want to be honest with y'all. This is one of the handful of the most faith-building passages to me in all the Bible. It's just so powerful because not only do we have Matthew, Mark, and Luke recording the events of the Transfiguration, but we have Peter, who we know was there, in his own epistle writing and talking about, hey, I was there, I saw that. That to me is such powerful evidence. Such powerful evidence. So, in this context, in the previous verses, we're going to start in verse 16. The previous verses, Peter is talking about the fact that he's going to depart soon. And so, if you're about to die, and you're on your deathbed, and you're talking to the people you love, what kind of things are you going to talk about? You're going to talk about the stuff that means the most to you. You're going to make sure that you mention the things that you want people to remember. This is, to me, like what Paul did in 2 Timothy 4. He said, my departure is at hand, and he gave some very powerful last instructions and words of exhortation and encouragement. And that's what Peter is doing here. So he says, let's read it, verse 16 through 18. For we did not follow cleverly devised tales when we made known to you the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ. But we were eyewitnesses of his majesty. And keep in mind, this is the same Peter that on the day of Pentecost stood there and said, you Jews killed him, God raised him, and we are witnesses. So here he is saying, we were eyewitnesses of his majesty. Verse 17, for when he received honor and glory from God the Father, such an utterance as this was made to him by the majestic glory, this is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. And we ourselves heard this utterance made from heaven when we were with him on the holy mountain. So powerful. We didn't follow cleverly devised tales. Most people that day were religious. They believed in multiple gods. They believed in lots of tales and these mystery religions of which they were a part, these stories that were not reality at all. He's saying, listen, this is not a bunch of made-up stuff. This is reality. People today think the Bible's full of fairy tales. Why do people think the Bible's full of fairy tales? Okay? Because they haven't read it. Okay? Why else?
It's hard to believe.
There's some stuff in there that's a little far-fetched.
There are religious people I know that are Christians that think, that Noah and Adam and Eve are just allegories and stories, because it can't possibly happen.
Right. Yeah, and I had a Bible study with a lady who, in the middle of the Bible study, she told me she was an atheist, which didn't help. But we were starting in Genesis, 3, and we were talking about the serpent, Satan appearing in the form of a serpent, and she just said, I can't believe that. I can't believe there was a talking serpent. It's kind of basically what she said. It's really hard for a lot of people to believe because we don't see talking serpents today, and we don't see waters being parted, and we don't see, the dead being raised and things like that. John?
My opinion here is we've come so far with science or whatever, education, whatever, and I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with it. I mean, engineering's great. I love it. 2 and 2 is 4. We make buildings stand upright. Okay? But there is also theoretical science.
Right.
All right? But the other thing is, a lot of people have forgot to have, quote, a mind like a child sometimes and think beyond kind of what's in front of you. If God is who God says He is, anything is possible, and everybody forgets that there is the possibility of a spiritual world, which we only live in 3 dimensions.
Right.
That's a whole other dimension.
Yeah.
We have no clue.
Yeah.
We can only measure things here.
Right.
In that dimension, you can't measure stuff.
Right. It's beyond our ability to really comprehend.
That's just it. So when we put all this more science and things and pieces of paper and everybody grabs onto it, and we have to, everything's going to, die in 20 years, we go do something. Everybody grabs on that, and then when you read something like this, like there's this guy who spent 120 years with gopher wood in the woods building an ark.
Right.
And he was loaded up with, animals.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Everybody's going, whatever.
Right. Yeah.
But there's still evidence that there's Roman chariot wheels at the bottom of the Dead Sea.
So let me speak to a little bit of what you just said, because that was a lot. That was good. Science. We can't just look at science and say it's all just a bunch of nonsense. There's a whole lot of science that's really, really good, solid stuff. But science doesn't say anything. Scientists do. And it is the scientists who come up with dogma, like the world is all there is. That's not a scientific statement. That's a philosophical, that's a religious statement only. Really, it comes down to their religious beliefs. There is matter only. Well, we can't prove that, right? That's a philosophical statement. And then they work into that a lot of dogma that absolutely rules out religion. But you can be a good science student and learn a lot of great things from science and still be a believer in the Bible. But filter our understanding of science through the Bible instead of vice versa. Don't filter through science our understanding of the Bible. That's the mistake. We have to look at science and say, I'm going to filter that through here. I'm going to filter the creation of the world. I'm going to filter, this whole idea of evolution. I'm going to filter that through Genesis 1. And then we see, well, that part of science doesn't hold up, right? So anyway, I'm going too much. We were almost out of time. I've got to move on. I'm so sorry. I wish we could talk longer. I just have to wrap it up here. This passage strengthens my faith. Hope it strengthens your faith. The apostles were eyewitnesses of His majesty. I want that thought to stick with you. Please read through page 91A for Wednesday. Jack, you've got 15 seconds.
No, it's Joy.
Joy, go ahead.
They're in it for about 6 minutes.
I'm so sorry. I didn't see you. Go ahead.
That's okay. Another thing is, if the Bible is just a bunch of fairy tales, then you're not responsible for obeying God's commands.
That's right. It's easy to believe it's a bunch of fairy tales because it doesn't demand anything of you, right? Great point. Thank you for making that point. All right. Appreciate everybody's comments, thoughts.